April 12, 1945. At around 3:30 p.m., Franklin Roosevelt, wartime and longest-serving U.S. president in history, dies of a cerebral hemorrhage. His vice president and designated successor Harry S. Truman had been attending a meeting at Capitol Building in Washington, D.C. He was summoned to the White House immediately, and at 7 p.m., he was sworn in as the President of the United States. I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me. President Truman has big shoes to fill. World War II has entered its final phase, with Nazi Germany losing ground on all fronts as Allied armies close in on Berlin. President Truman shifts his attention to containing the expected Soviet influence in Europe, while still managing warm relations with them. This is not aided by the uncompromising hardline panic-mongering of Winston Churchill. Despite his self-doubt and inexperience, Truman will be advised by his veteran Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, who has been in this role since 1911 under William Howard Taft, and again under Roosevelt in 1940. April 25, 1945. Henry Stimson and General Leslie Groves briefed Truman about the existence of the atomic bomb. This is not Truman's first encounter with the notion of a superweapon being developed in the US. He himself knew about the development of the atomic bomb to an extent when he was a senator, leading a committee into government spending on military equipment. The atomic bomb was very expensive to develop, requiring vast amounts of land acquisition and raw materials. The knowledge of the bomb is important, as Truman must shift his focus to the Pacific Front, where the costly ongoing Battle of Okinawa is currently raging. Well-dug-in and fanatical Japanese resistance is causing alarmingly costly losses against US forces. This is following the same example seen in Iwo Jima, fought a few months prior. However, for now, there is no plan for any practical use for an untested bomb. Truman had not previously known to what extent this weapon was destructive or how effective it would be. It was possibly one of the many wonder weapons created. In fact, when Truman was initially briefed, he didn't understand the technical details in full and wanted to wait for the actual testing. Truman only has a basic understanding of the destructive capability of the weapon, and as of now, he has no intention of using the bomb. There are minor developments in setting up of a committee to discussing the usage of the bomb by Stimson, and on May 8th, Germany surrenders unconditionally to the Allies, allowing the occupation of Berlin and Western Germany by the Western Allies. The Allies had previously agreed to allow Poland to fall within the Soviet sphere of influence at Yalta, and they naively expected Stalin to give Poland freedom and democratic elections. Stalin did not interpret it this way, and effectively turned Poland into a communist puppet state, allowing Truman and making him distrust the Soviets even more, as they would conquer Europe. However, after a meeting with the committee in May 31st, American policy makers realized that the relations between the United States and the Soviet Union were the key to post-war peace, and some concessions had to be made to the Soviet Union to join the war against Japan. Thus, Truman U-turned his stance towards the Soviets and expected to offer them concessions in Western Europe and Asia for their entry into the war. However, realizing that he needed leverage when dealing with the more experienced world power leaders, Truman delayed the Potsdam meeting until mid-July 1945. He put immense pressure on the scientists to get the bomb field tested by early July, and they eventually got it done during the conference itself on the 16th. And when Truman received the report, he became a changed man. His negotiating stance became a lot more hardline, challenging Stalin's claims and guarantees on Western Europe. He suddenly gained the confidence of someone with aces. His timid, second-guessing nature was long gone. With atomic superiority came absolute power that gave Truman so much confidence that he went off the script with Stalin. As it was previously decided that the US would develop the weapon in secret and not betray any details to the Soviet Union. However, Truman vaguely mentioned a weapon of mass destruction was being possessed by the US, which prompted Stalin to nervousness over US atomic superiority, since the USSR was now lagging behind. Thus, the bomb was implicitly used for political leverage against the Soviets even before the actual bombing of Japan. With the successful test of the bomb, the stage was set for the final question to be answered: how and if the bomb should be used on Japan. The most obvious reason was military justification, and indeed, this justification was given to the public and the rest of the world. Military considerations such as the casualty estimates reached up to 1 million US men for the subjugation of the Japanese homeland. This would require conscription, and there was no fixed timeline given for when the war would end by the Chief of Staff. The reason for this was the past American experience fighting the Japanese on the outer islands, in which the American casualty ratio was almost 1-to-1 for each battle, and the defeated Japanese opted for suicide rather than surrender, the brutality extending this practice to their own civilians. More practically, despite its catastrophic loss in skilled pilots, Japan trained kamikaze pilots who required minimal training to manually guide their planes as guided torpedoes into ships, which proved devastatingly effective. Furthermore, the Japanese still had many troops in China and Manchuria, which they could recall to defend Japan. Hence, the US was considering military casualties as a main reason for seeking an alternative way to end the war in the Pacific. Furthermore, President Truman was hurrying the Soviets to declare war on Japan, to tie down its troops in Asia, and give Japan an unwinnable conflict with war on all fronts. Furthermore, as Truman had previously fought in World War I, he is more empathetic to saving American lives and avoiding trading American lives for bitter political gain, which is repeated from his stance in Europe, where he turned down Churchill's request to push towards Berlin. Diminishing the military argument of the cost of lives, the US Navy virtually blockaded Japan and could stop any attempt to recall its troops into China, making the Soviet Union's entry into the war a lot less necessary. So much so that Truman pushed for a quicker decision for the invasion of Japan before the Soviets gained too much ground. Since an armistice was out of a question, learned from the Treaty of Versailles, and furthermore, complete US air superiority over Japan meant that the bombing of Japanese cities were already carried out, but produced little result in terms of the Japanese wanting to sue for peace. Investigating the target of the bomb, we can see that the US wanted a city mostly untouched by a conventional bombing to display the true strength of the bomb. The US considered dropping the bomb on an uninhabited piece of land in Japan as a warning and as a show of strength, but this was not practical, as wasting half of the nation's atomic capability after so much expended resources did not make sense, since they were fighting a war. The US wanted to minimize civilian casualties and considered forewarning the Japanese population. However, more than reducing the military effectiveness of the bomb by such a move, as military equipment would be evacuated and the bomb crews be endangered, the shock value would not be felt. Hence, the eventual target was chosen, as we can see, more for political means, as a shock factor to frighten the Japanese, more than that of military aims, as Hiroshima was not the main US military objective. It was rather Kyushu, which was struck off the target list, as Truman felt that a culturally rich city should not be a target, as its destruction might resurge Japanese will to fight. Therefore, there was great shock value to get Japan to surrender, as the atomic bomb has shock value like no other. It is a single show of absolute force that no other conventional bombing run can replicate.
To this day, there are still debates on Truman's true motives behind the decision to authorize the use of nuclear weapons against Japanese cities and civilians. Many scholars have believed that many factors played a part in influencing the decision to drop the atomic bomb. But there remain two groups that argue that a single cause was primarily responsible. The latter is split into two opposing positions on the bomb, which we refer to as the revisionist and orthodox positions. There is also the middle ground position, in which they draw elements from both the revisionist and orthodox interpretations. It argues that the atomic bomb was indeed the fastest way to end the war, but that it was unnecessary and was not the only way it could have been done. First, what is the orthodox position? They are the group of scholars that holds the position that Truman employed the nuclear weapon solely to end the war in the Pacific as soon as possible and to prevent a bloody invasion of the Japanese mainland, which is an explanation that dates back from Truman's official statements in the aftermath of the bombings.
We have used it against those who attack us without warning at Pearl Harbor, against those who have starved and beaten and executed American prisoners of war, against those who have abandoned all pretense of obeying international laws of warfare. We have used it in order to shorten the agony of war, in order to save the lives of thousands and thousands of young Americans.
This argument was further expanded in an influential article published under the name of former Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who had supervised the American atomic bomb project during both Roosevelt and Truman's administrations. Published as The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb in 1947, its central argument was that the United States was faced with a choice between an invasion of the Japanese home islands that would have cost over 1 million casualties to American forces alone, or to deploy the bomb to shock the Japanese ruling oligarchy into surrender. Weighing these two options, Truman and his advisors concluded that the use of the bomb was their least abhorrent choice. Historian and former State Department official Herbert Weiss presented a significant scholarly reinterpretation of the conventional stance. With his exclusive access to a number of formerly classified documents, he reduced the emphasis on the simplistic choice between using the bomb or launching an invasion, while still maintaining the focus on the pivotal role of compelling Japanese surrender in American decision-making. Though he acknowledged the possibility that American and British leaders might have seen the additional diplomatic advantages, such as impressing the Soviet Union with dramatic proof of Western power, he denied that anti-Soviet motives had any significant role in the decision. He concluded that the one reason deemed paramount by Truman and his advisors was that using the bomb will save many American lives and end the war most quickly. Contrary to the orthodox position were the revisionists, where the Cold War and the Soviet Union were the focus as explanation for the use of the bomb. The term originating from a book by Nobel Prize-winning British physicist Patrick Blackett, Military and Political Consequences of Atomic Energy. He highlighted several inconsistencies in the Stimson article and other orthodox explanations. Utilizing memoirs, journalistic sources, and evidence from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, USSBS, Blackett argued that the combination of conventional bombing and a naval blockade had brought Japan to its knees by the summer of 1945. In addition, Soviet entry into the war in the Pacific has further exerted more military and diplomatic pressure on Japan. Blackett argued that the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was unnecessary, since the combination of conventional bombing and Soviet entry will almost certainly result in a surrender prior to the invasion. Gar Alperovitz's account in Atomic Diplomacy supported Blackett's argument that anti-Soviet motives were the primary factors in Truman's decision. Drawing from memoirs, documents from the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff and the USSBS, Alperovitz concluded that this decision to use the weapon did not derive from overriding military considerations. Truman and his advisors had been governed by two motives. The first was to end the war before the Red Army could occupy Japanese-held territory in China. The second was to present a combat demonstration of the bomb to persuade the Russians to accept the American proposal for a stable peace. More and more arguments appeared one after another. A significant portion of orthodox arguments deal with the specific role of military intelligence and casualty estimates in influencing Truman's decision. There was evidence, such as intercepted Japanese diplomatic and military communications, under the wartime codenames Magic and Ultra, which was able to give Truman and his advisors information regarding politics and military defense of Japan. There was alarming evidence meticulously traced by Edward Drea that convinced American military leaders that an invasion of Kyushu would lead to significant casualties. The Orthodox camp contended through a thorough study that casualty estimates were an important factor in Truman's decision. Personally, I am more convinced by the revisionist arguments. The American leaders, Stimson argued, had acted on the assumption that the bomb was a legitimate weapon, and thus felt no need to justify its use, which Barton J. Bernstein, a very influential atomic bomb scholar, agreed with. The atomic bomb strikes, crudely described by Campbell Craig and Sergei Radchenko, is that we can regard Hiroshima as the final American strike of the Second World War and Nagasaki as the first strike in the Cold War. Tsuyoshi Hasegawa, who based his research in Soviet, Japanese, and American archives, did an analysis on Japanese decision-making and concluded that even though the bomb did exert extra pressure to end the war, Soviet entry was far more significant in Japan's decision to surrender. And he said, even without atomic bombs, the war most likely would have ended shortly after Soviet entry into the war, before November 1. What truly convinced me was an article written by Edward Fuller, An Economic Case Against the Atomic Bombing of Japan, in which he delves deeply into the economic conditions of both Japan and the US during World War II. Fuller demonstrates the overwhelming advantage the US had over Japan, suggesting that the atomic bomb was unnecessary, since Japan would have surrendered to the US even without its use. Most of the statistics he provides are obtained from John Ellis' encyclopedic work titled World War II, A Statistical Survey, 1993, and gives comprehensive arguments pertaining to economy. Fuller emphasized that a government's ability to wage war is a function of the economy's ability to produce war goods. He states that war goods production statistics from the Second World War make 3 points clear. First, the US had a monumental advantage in war goods production over Japan and all other major war powers. Second, the Japanese economy was collapsing in 1945. And third, US war goods production declined in many important categories after 1943. I will brief through the statistics that are relevant to the points mentioned, but I will only include those of Japan and the US. You can pause the video if you wish to take a closer look at the statistics. First, let's take a look at their war goods. Military spending is a great indicator of a country's economic capacity to wage war. The US military spending alone was 5.7 times greater than Japan's, with Japanese GDP only 23.3% of U.S. military spending. U.S. gun production, military truck production, and tank production far exceeded Japan's throughout the conflict. The Pacific War was mainly a war of navies. Hence, the U.S. Navy inflicted the most damage on Japan's economy. Fuller also stated that Japan's Navy was superior to the U.S. Pacific Fleet in every category at the beginning of the war. However, the U.S.'s naval production surpassed Japan's throughout the war. The carrier was a definitive naval weapon, and with the U.S.'s economic advantage, they were able to produce more carriers during the war. The Japanese Navy suffered greater losses. On top of its naval superiority, the U.S. also had superior air power over Japan. In 1942, the U.S. had about 1,000 more combat aircrafts, and by the end of the war, the U.S. had 4.8 times more combat aircraft. The U.S.'s aircraft production was 5.4 times more, with 3.6 and 8.3 times more fighters and bombers respectively. By 1945, Japanese aircraft production has dropped by 70.7%. We should also account for merchant shipping, as they provide the army with vital supplies needed for the war. As the table shows, the US's total production of merchant ships was 9.4 times greater than Japan's. On top of all these, the US were industrially superior, as they had advanced technologies such as the radar. They also had better intelligence gathering, such as the Magic and Ultra codenames I mentioned before. Saying that the US knew all Japanese naval movements is not far-fetched. Admiral William D. Leahy, the highest-ranking US military officer throughout the Second World War, reported that the US had overwhelming superiority in sea and air forces. The commanding general of the Air Force, Henry Hap Arnold, and other senior Air Force officers were already well aware in September 1944 that Japan had been defeated before the atomic bomb. A quote from Alperovitz states that, without the support of Japan's sea power and air power, Japan's land forces cannot do anything except hold out in isolated, beleaguered spots all over the map until bombs, bullets, disease, and starvation kill them off. Next, let's take a look at the statistics on both countries' economies. During the war, Japan's imports of strategic raw materials fell sharply. Steel, a fundamental war material during the Second World War, was scarce in Japan. Japanese steel production declined by 90% between 1943 and 1945, while US steel production was approximately 10 times greater. On top of it, Japan's steel imports dropped down by 81.5% during the war. Iron ore is used to produce steel, and that too Japan has low production of, with only 6.9% of US production, before its collapse by 87.8% between 1942 and 1945. Not to mention the drop in iron ore imports of 94.6% the Japanese had during the war. Coal, another war essential, has its production in Japan collapsed by 82.1%, while US coal production was 8.6 times greater in 1942. Japan's coal imports had also dropped by 91.5%. Aluminium was needed to build aircrafts and other various parts, and the US had 7.3 times larger production than the Japanese in 1942, with Japan's production dropping by 95% between 1943 and 1945. Crude oil, of course, is another essential strategic resource of the Second World War, needed to operate many war goods. From what we've seen in the previous table, the US was already the largest oil producer in the world before the war. In 1943, the US's oil production was staggeringly 455.5 times of Japan's. Other countries, including Japan, were already dependent on US oil prior to the war. Japan was heavily dependent on foreign oil before the war, and the US exploited this fact by choking Japan's oil supply. Even with their strategic oil reserves, it wasn't enough to support them beyond 1945. On top of the metal and oil crisis, Japan had a severe food crisis. Over 70% of Japanese territory is mountainous, and only 15% of it is arable. The mountainous terrain makes it difficult to grow crops and livestock. Japan's oil crisis hampered transportation, and this also compounded the food crisis. The US had destroyed Japanese shipping and railroad networks. By August 1945, Japan was unable to transport food to population centers, causing a full-scale food crisis. On top of rations, they had to introduce peanut shells, sawdust, tea leaves, seeds, worms, bugs, rats, and powder made by drying the blood of cows, horses, and pigs. Admiral Ernest J. King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet and Chief of Naval Operations, believed that the dilemma between invading Japan and using the atomic bomb was an unnecessary one, as even without the invasion, Japan's economic crisis would have forced them into submission. The table here summarizes war production statistics between 1942 and 1945, showing that the US won the production battle decisively. Finally, it is known that US production of many vital war goods declined considerably after 1943. Why is this significant? It's because the production was cut off before the atomic bombs were even complete. This suggests that the US was confident that they would win the war even without the atomic bombs. To finish off, the US also had great territorial and population advantage. There were 16.4 million Americans in the armed forces compared to 9.1 million Japanese. The casualties were about 13.8 Japanese for every 1 American, though about 2/3 of Japanese military deaths were due to starvation or illness. Still, the ratio of Japanese to American casualties is about 4.6 to 1. The US already knew that they would win the war against Japan before the war even started. US war planners had developed a strategy between 1906 and 1941 called War Plan Orange. The strategist who developed this plan had already known that Japan is deficient in nearly every important strategic war material. Debates regarding the use of the atomic bomb remain fresh. In my opinion, the extent of military circumstances on the decision to use the bomb on Japan was not as significant as the extent of political circumstances, which has to do with the Soviet Union. The economic case provided by Fuller, combined with statements from the American generals, seems to strongly suggest that this is true. Going back to the description by Craig and Radchenko, Hiroshima as the final American strike of the Second World War and Nagasaki as the first strike in the Cold War, I feel that this statement is pretty accurate. To add on, Admiral Leahy thought that the atomic bombing was unnecessary. He compared their ethical standard as common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. Even Admiral William Halsey Jr., who is infamous for his hatred towards the Japanese, states that it was an unnecessary experiment. It was a mistake to ever drop it.